All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for a visit with the Carter Presidential Library. And specifically, today's presentation is entitled Jimmy Carter, Alaska, and the Antiquities Act. So between 1978 and 1980, President Carter used the Antiquities Act of 1906 as leverage to bring Congress to the table and pass the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which protected over 150 million acres of public land and expedited implementation of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. So was he justified, or did he exceed his constitutional authority? And were there checks or balances to his actions by the other branches of government, federal or state? And has the Antiquities Act strengthened or weakened our democracy? These and other questions will be discussed during this presentation that will examine primary sources from the holdings of the Carter Library and National Archives and Records Administration. And this is all led by Joshua Montanari, who's the education specialist at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. So all nearly 100 or so who are watching live and the other couple of hundred that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Joshua for being with us this afternoon. And Joshua, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that introduction. You reminded me I might have to cut down that program description a little bit. It's great to have everyone here with us today. A lot of you in Massachusetts, also North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Argentina, Los Angeles. It's great to be with you wherever you're joining us from. As Robert mentioned, I'm Joshua Montanari. I work at the Jimmy Carter Library. And today we'll be talking about Jimmy Carter, Alaska, and the Antiquities Act. Not a lot of folks associate Jimmy Carter with Alaska, president from Georgia, but he's a central figure in the United States history of conservation. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second for that to go through. Get my slideshow going. Okay. Oh, okay, so today in this program, it is a lot to cover, but we'll try to get it all in within an hour or so. We'll talk about the Russian colonial history in Alaska, about Alaska and the United States, ANCSA. There's a lot of long acronyms with legislation in Alaska. The Antiquities Act of 1906, ANILCA, the big one, the Alaska Lands Bill, and we'll talk about the constitutional checks and balances on President Carter and his administration's actions with Alaska. So there we see a master file of the 49th state. A lot of people in Alaska, if they try to tell you where they're from, they'll use their hand. You kind of see the shape of it there. You know, they'll say I'm from here in Juneau or up here in Fairbanks. It's a little insider stuff for you folks out there. But a question to think about, and feel free to put a response in the chat now if you want, but we can talk about it later. But just to think about this through the program, you know, what is the government's responsibility to protect the environment or our natural and cultural scientific history? Places like what you see on the screen there, Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, what is now Mesa Verde National Park. A lot of places in the American Southwest were a big influence for our government to do something to protect cultural history, environmental history with places like Mesa Verde, like Chaco Canyon. So that's really when this conversation starts. We had parks where we thought big natural places was really all there was to parks. Then we start thinking about it culturally. And that's where we'll get the Antiquities Act that we'll talk about later. But the Antiquities Act definitely expands beyond relics of the American Southwest. But think about that as we go through our program today. What is the government's responsibility? Do they have to step in at all? When is it that they step in? So just a little background on Alaska. The name itself is an Aleut word, Alyeska, meaning great land. It's a pretty big state, as I think we all know, over 663,000 square miles. There are a lot of different tribes in Alaska. There tends to be, I think, a lot of stereotypes when it comes to indigenous people in Alaska. There's 231 different tribes up there. 17 of the 20 highest peaks, 100,000 glaciers, more than 6,600 miles of coastline. I believe there's a John Muir quote that Alaska was nature's preserve. Now, as far as the Russian colonial period, like Europeans coming to the east coast of North America, the Russians are drawn to Alaska for commercial profit. They have a first expedition in the 1730s. They get to the Aleutian Islands by the 1740s. At that point, they start forcefully employing indigenous people. These folks were known as Promlashleniki. That's a mouthful. They were the ones that would kind of get out there in the trenches, so to speak, of the fur trade. And what you see on the screen there, that's what Russians were in Alaska for, not empire, not setting up new territory to conquer. They just wanted to get in, make a buck, and get out. This is what they were making it off of, was sea otters. So they had a lot of commercial competition within their own ranks. Eventually, they all consolidate into the Russian American Company by the 1790s. The gentleman you see on the screen there, Alexander Baranov, becomes the chief of the Russian American Company. It's kind of a dual role. He's kind of a CEO and governor, so he's got the political and the business leadership entrusted to him. Again, much like Massachusetts Bay Company, Russian American Company, and same goals that they have. With the Russians, while we think of that huge expanse of Alaska, again, they're there hunting sea otters. We don't have sea otters up on Denali. They really never go more than 100 miles from the coast, which brings up some interesting questions when they sell it to us in the 1860s. In fact, they never really settled the border of Yukon territory in Alaska until I think the 1930s. So the sea otters are getting depleted in Northwest Alaska, closer to Russia. They turn to the southeast portion of Alaska. In that area, we have a few different tribes, among them the Tlingit tribe. They're already trading resources with the Americans and the British in exchange for their commodities, mostly firearms. Glass beads are a big one that becomes a cultural mainstay of Alaska Native artwork, cultural items. So the Russian American Company negotiates with the Tlingit in Sitka, Alaska, in the southeast, telling them we're just going to have a little tiny trading post here. You're not even going to know we're here. Doesn't quite go that way. They build this large fort you see in the drawing on the screen there. That does not go over well with the Tlingit. They attack the fort, drive the Russians out in 1802. The Russians take a couple years to regroup. They come back. At this point, the Tlingits have gotten a few tips from the British and the Americans on how to build a modern fortification. And that's what we see on the screen there. It was known as Shishkanu at the mouth of the Indian River in Sitka. Alexander Baranov organizes a war party, including forced Aleut and Aleutic hunters that have been coerced into service. Initially, things go well for the Tlingit, but then the Russians do find their gunpowder reserves on a small island out in the harbor. They destroy that. It becomes a battle of attrition. So the Russians do essentially blockade them. And eventually the Tlingit do retreat from the fort. And there's an uneasy peace. For about 20 years, it's kind of really, the Tlingits are in the mountains. They're blocking other commerce from reaching the Russians there. They eventually come to a peace agreement in the 1820s. But just to give you an idea of what that battle looked like, these are two paintings that they have. I believe these are at Sitka National Historical Park with the National Park Service. On the right, you see the battle. You see the Tlingit leader Katlian. That hammer and helmet he's wearing is in the care of the National Park Service. Sometimes it's on display. Sometimes the local Tlingit tribe comes and takes those items to use in ceremonies. So they're really like living artifacts, you could say. And what you're seeing on the left was those forced Aleut and Aleutique hunters literally having to tow the Russians in to position to attack the fort um, there. So that's what consolidates Russian control of Alaska, so to speak. Now, where does the United States come in? Well, in the 19th century, in the 1850s, we have the Crimean War between Russia and Britain. Um, Basically pits Russia against all of Europe at that point. Lincoln, on the other hand, in our own country, he's desperate to prevent the British and French from intervening in the United States Civil War when that comes around in the 1860s. So more or less, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that old adage. We have abolitionist movement here in the United States, paralleling calls to end serfdom in Russia. Both of those do happen. Alexander II, we see there, ends serfdom. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation to begin the process of ending slavery. The United States is basically providing covert aid to Russia to circumvent British blockades in the Pacific Northwest. And Lincoln's looking up there and thinking, we really need to consolidate that. We have California um, at that time, Washington, Oregon territory. We need to get what's above that there as well. So they definitely have some things in common here, some things to bond over. Eventually, the sale does take place. It's after Lincoln's death in 1868 for $7.2 million, less than 2 cents an acre. Again, not sure what gave Russia the impression they could sell all of what we know as Alaska today. We hadn't even explored the overwhelming majority of it, but it does take place. Um, Russia thinks they're getting a great deal because, hey, it's all out of sea otters. That's the only thing they're really worth making money from. So good luck having your big chunk of land that you control with nothing in it. Uh, that fortune changes in the 1890s when we discover gold and we go from folly to fortune. People start flooding into Alaska. They haven't really stopped since. We've made more than $1 trillion off of that $7.2 million investment that you see on the actual check there on the screen. So we're going to fast forward a few decades here. Only have an hour. Alaska gained statehood in 1959, proclaimed by Dwight Eisenhower. You ever see a photograph from the Eisenhower Library where they're unveiling the 49 star flag? We haven't had Hawaii join us yet. So this is, and this part of this is includes a mandate for one. This is a big one. This causes a lot of contention later. 104 million acres of land in Alaska to be transferred to state control. Any existing Alaska Native land claims, when I say Alaska Native, I mean indigenous, um, they're unaffected for later settlement. So kind of kicking that can down the road. And lands deemed vacant by the state can be claimed by it. So that creates a lot of contention between Alaska Natives and the new state government. So a little bit of a rocky start, a lot of uncertainty, but seems everyone's confident we're going to figure everything out later down the road. 1967, the Alaska Federation of Natives is formed to address Alaska land claims because we're almost a decade later. Not really much action is happening there. They're looking to either get land or get financial settlements for lands that they have claims to. It's moving real slow, but then there's an economic impetus. We discovered black gold, oil in Alaska in 1968 up in Prudhoe Bay. We're going to need a pipeline to transport all that oil south to Valdez for refining or shipment elsewhere. Nixon approves it, but we have to get these land claims settled. And it's going to take a while because when they want to build that pipeline, every time they come across a new landowner, there's a new settlement that has to be worked out. They have one governor in Alaska, Keith Miller, in 1969. He just doesn't recognize any land claims by Alaska natives. So there's a bit of a stalemate there, no progress really happens at that point. But then we get a more open governor, William Egan. I think he sees the writing on the wall. He's responsive to AFN. Emil Noddy, their president, we see in the photograph there, the two of them together. they had a pretty good relationship. So they start actually advancing things forward. They get the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed in 1971. So what that did was basically promise these tribes of Alaska. Uh, Now there's 231 tribes. That's a lot of tribes to deal with. What this law did was organize them into 13 native corporations for the government to interact with, basically regional. They're kind of put together. Um, and each of those corporations will receive part of, it's a sum somewhere around 720 something $1 million. So we're talking compensation here uh, for Alaska natives there. So this is really a big step. But again, there's nothing really there to implement this and get the ball rolling. It's passed. We're going to do this. Um, but things don't really happen as fast as folks would like. Let's see. It does also inspire a little bit of stewardship. The Alaska Coalition, we have all these disparate conservation groups advocating and lobbying Washington to pass a comprehensive lands bill. They all get together, combine their forces, become the Alaska Coalition. We can see a press release that they have over there. It's talking about of one of the votes happening in Congress, but they get to have a big voice. So we've got Alaska Native organizations, we've got um, nonprofit conservation associations going, the federal government's working on this, the Alaska state government. It's a lot of folks at the table here. Um, I'm sorry, because here's a slide on that Alaska Native Settlement Act. Okay, now I misquoted that number. It was actually 963 million. So basically $1 billion, plus 44 million acres of land to be distributed amongst them, uh, and gave the Secretary of Interior authority to withdraw an additional 80 million acres of land for conservation consideration. In other words, we're going to take this 80 million acres of land as well. We might not end up using all of it, but we're going to study and see what it is that which is good for industrial use, which might be good for recreational use, and so on and so on. This did come with a deadline, 1978. So they had 7, 8 years to get this worked out. So we get a new sense of urgency. And this could be a whole other program about the, in fact, it is another program, the energy crisis that I have. So that's in the news a lot right now, still affecting our lives today. But at this point in history, early 70s, we're getting about 25% of all of our crude oil from OPEC nations in the Middle East. We just took all that cheap oil for granted. Well, when the Arab nations and Israel had another war in 1973, 74, the Arab coalition really made us pay a price for our support of Israel. They have an Arab oil embargo. Oil shoots up 350%. There's really no facet of American life that's untouched by it. So with that comes layoffs, comes inflation, stagflation, so double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation. A lot of folks are hurting right now. We've got historically low unemployment, something between 3 and 4%. Inflation has even been tamped down quite a bit, down to 3%. These folks are dealing in double digits, something to keep in mind. But again, this puts an impetus on getting a comprehensive Alaska lands bill, because the Carter administration is going to be taking an all of the above approach to the energy crisis. Oil, solar, electric, coal, gas, nuclear, it's just all of the above. So this is going to be a big part of the Carter administration's response to the energy crisis once they take up the reins of government. Again, we mentioned about the oil being found up in Prudhoe Bay has to be transported to where it can be refined or shipped elsewhere to refineries abroad. The Alaska pipeline is how that's done. It does have to be above ground. If anyone here knows anything about permafrost, the way the soil shifts, changing of the seasons, that's why it's above ground and not buried. So it's approved by Nixon. We can see in this photograph here, continued under the Ford administration. There's President Ford. doing a field inspection there. But again, it's getting slowed down because we have to keep negotiating person by person, tribe by tribe. Um, so Carter's under a lot of pressure to get this lands bill done. And this is a big part of his message on the energy and the environment. When we think about Alaska, resources there, energy and environment, natural resources, there's national heritage. Big part of his environmental message that he gives, and we can see a photograph of that from the National Archives on our screen. So Jimmy Carter really needs to deliver something here. So to give a little civics background on this, it is Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution tells the president he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments. So we see that happening here. It's kind of mundane, but need to see it play out, see the Constitution in real action, in real life. There's Carter writing a letter to his Secretary of the Interior, Cecil Andrews, asking for his opinion on land withdrawals in Alaska and ones suitable for designation as national monuments under the Antiquities Act. Then in the other document that's on our screen, we see the response from Cecil Andrews to take actions under the Antiquities Act to create national monuments to provide strong and certain protection to the most critical areas. So we're getting some clues here what this Antiquities Act is all about. Okay, and that's where you see those where they're the meat of those documents there in the circled portion. Okay, I'll go ahead and move on. So the Antiquities Act. This is passed in 1906. And here's really the meat of it there on the screen, that a president can more or less circumvent Congress and declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest. And really, as I mentioned early in the program, the impetus of this was what was going on in the Southwest primarily, where we're seeing a lot of pot hunters going to archaeological sites out there. We needed a means to protect it. And so it's initially meant for that, but it evolves. The interpretations of it are expanded over time. And it's a law that's been used by just about every president since Teddy Roosevelt up through Joe Biden. I think there's maybe two exceptions. It might be, I think it's Dwight Eisenhower and possibly George H.W. Bush, I think. But I think it's one or two presidents are the only ones that haven't used this. And we see Teddy Roosevelt there. He gets this new power. And Teddy Roosevelt, he really makes good use of it. A notable place he makes use of it is when he declares Grand Canyon National Monument. See a photograph of the Grand Canyon there in 1871. Roosevelt declares this a national monument in 1908. There's a lot of mining interests in the area, no regulation whatsoever. All of that continues while this plays out in court because naturally his declaration is challenged and the Antiquities Act is challenged. But the Supreme Court does rule that it's valid and constitutionally legal as it was a law passed by Congress. The Grand Canyon does get full national park protection in 1919, and that's President Woodrow Wilson that does that. So essentially, a president, when they can declare a national monument, doesn't necessarily mean Congress has to fund it. It also doesn't mean that it can't later be undone by an act of Congress. It gets more difficult when Congress authorizes the national park and has more protections and funding mechanisms in place. Let's see, Wyoming is another case where the Antiquities Act comes into question. So we already had Yellowstone National Park. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to establish what he called a greater Yellowstone. Eventually that comes to be Grand Teton National Park. But the big fight went on out there. We had a lot of ranchers protesting, things like that. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Go ahead and have your Grand Teton National Park, but from this moment forth, no further extension or establishment of national parks or monuments in Wyoming may be undertaken except by express authorization of the Congress. So now we have a legal precedent established that, okay, the Antiquities Act is constitutional, but states can negotiate with the federal government on a case by case basis of how it applies to their state. A little messy, but it seems to make all parties happy. And by the way, we have not declared any new national parks in the state of Wyoming since Grand Teton National Park. So Carter's waiting for Congress to fulfill United States commitments. According to the Alaska National Claims Settlement Act, that we remember we had a 1978 deadline. It comes and goes. So now it's President Carter's turn to invoke the Antiquities Act. And when he does this first in December 1978, he sets aside a 56 million acre chunk of Alaska lands that he's going to declare as various national monuments. Secretary of Interior Andrews, who we see behind Carter in the photograph here, withdraws an additional 40 million acres for a 20-year period of consideration. So we're looking at 96 million acres here. So really what Carter's doing here, it's putting the pressure now on Congress, putting the ball in their court, basically saying, come together, get this law done, or else this is how it's going to go. It's just going to be my decree, and you're not going to have a say in it, essentially. It's a little political strong arming with the Antiquities Act. So when he does this, folks in Alaska, not so happy about it at that time. The state of Alaska, first off, sues the federal government for not failing to meet the deadline of ANCSA, also for exceeding the 80 million acre consideration of ANCSA. We see acts of civil disobedience and unrest like the one here. That's actually President Carter being burned in effigy there with that crowd around. I heard President Carter remark before that he visited the Alaska State Fair. I think it was in 79 or 80, and he saw a dunking booth where folks could choose to throw a ball at either Ayatollah Khomeini, the Iran hostage crisis happening, or Jimmy Carter. And he said the line was way longer for people to throw balls to dunk Jimmy Carter than the Ayatollah. So if that tells you anything about the sentiment at that time, here's a little bit more about the sentiment. This is a sign outside of, I believe it was a bar restaurant there in Alaska. Another sign from a rally against Carter's proclamations. Take this J.C. and Company monument and shove it. So folks not so happy up there. But again, we have to put ourselves in their analog shoes, not just analog shoes, middle of nowhere Alaska wilderness analog shoes. It's not like today where you have all this information at their fingertips. All they know is the government declared something that they didn't have a say in. They don't like that. So we really have to understand that at this time. So eventually Carter gets the message through to Congress, even after he loses the election to Ronald Reagan. Because if they don't get this worked out before Reagan, really a lot of the process resets. It's also convincing a lot of folks on the conservation side to accept compromises to get it done before a new administration comes in, and they do get it done. On December 2nd, 1980, Carter does sign the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA, into law. This provides for the implementation of Alaska Natives Claims Settlement Act, so they get that $1 billion, they get their 44 million acres of land. Alaska gets its 104 million acres of land that it was promised back in 1959. Better late than never, I guess. And here we see another precedent using that state by state application of the Antiquities Act. So Alaska basically declares that in their state, the Antiquities Act is only applicable for designations 5,000 acres or less. And there probably won't be too many of those at that. If they are that, it's probably going to be a smaller historic site. It won't have any kind of commercial value, mineral extraction value. So they'll probably be fine with that. Um, if it is over 5,000 acres, it's probably a wild, vast natural area somewhere, and there probably is something that a dollar could be made off of. That's the reasoning behind that. So we now have a new application of the Antiquities Act, seeing it get checked by the state of Alaska there. So this really is one of those rare pieces of American legislation where it has far-reaching impacts, and it really is a pretty balanced compromise. I mean, there's naturally going to be folks that disagree with that. But yeah, this was a huge effort, decades in the making. Really fits that theme of Carter's presidency, where it seems like a lot of things that were not necessarily his doing were building for a while and came to the surface right when he comes to office. And this was one of those things. And it was a big victory for Carter. At this time, we had the hostage crisis in Iran, again, stagflation happening. This was a big victory for Carter. But a lot of folks see this as the most significant piece of conservation legislation in our nation's history. This did, I believe, it triples the acreage of wilderness designation in our nation. Clarified subsistence rights for Alaska Natives. Provided comprehensive federal guidance on transportation and utility corridors, oil and gas leasing, mining. Again, the energy crisis is happening. We got to figure out how to get things down to the lower 48 where it's mostly needed. Public access on public lands, as we see here, hunting, trapping, fishing. So really clarified a lot of things up in Alaska, which really was, kind of like a really wild Northwest frontier at that point in time. If you're curious about new public land units, it was about 34 units, either new or expanded as a result of this law. So chances are, if you have visited Alaska, it was probably going to one of these places. It really does create almost a permanent pipeline of ecotourism in the state. Really, before ANILCA, not too many folks were going up there. You went to Alaska for the most part if you were working. You were in the timber industry, in the fishing industry, mining industry, in one of the trades. Not too many other people went up there. A lot of the parks up there didn't get sometimes more than 100 people a year, but this really opened it up to the rest of the world to get that permanent pipeline. These numbers are a little old, probably got to update my stats there, but from 2017, we have a few numbers there. Really, visitors spending $2.8 billion, more than 2 million people going up, $4.5 billion economic impact. And for a state that has probably around maybe 700,000 people in that whole state, big state of Alaska, it's like 2/3 the size of the lower 48. It's basically got about the population of, I would say a Baltimore or Philadelphia spread out across that. So that is a huge impact for people up there. Jimmy Carter is recognized a little bit later down the road in 2016 by the National Park Service. They made him an honorary National Park Ranger at Jimmy Carter National Historic Site in Plains, Georgia, where he still resides today. He had a statue within the National Park Service, 39 units in that agency, and this is a one-term president. He also created a lot of programs that came to be a part of what's now known as the NPS urban agenda to reach folks in the city. So that was a real big honor for President Carter. He's very proud of his status as a ranger. I've heard him talk about it in public appearances in the past. And the debate is definitely continuing about the Antiquities Act today. Two places that are hot spots. Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which was signed into law by Bill Clinton. For some reason, at the Grand Canyon and not at Grand Staircase Escalante. It's a fickle thing. I'm sure it was probably something with scheduling that day. I don't know. But he signs that monument into law in '96. It's in Utah. Also, Bears Ears National Monument, created by Obama in 2016, also in Utah. So when the Trump administration came in, they have an interpretation of the Antiquities Act that, yes, we can create national monuments. I believe they basically they recognize you can't completely rescind it by presidential proclamation, but you can modify it by a proclamation. So that's their interpretation of it. Trump reduces Grand Staircase Escalante by half, Bears Ears by 85%. They open a lot of that. There's new open lands to commercial permitting. Not a lot of bites because it's going to be seesaw. They recognize the pattern here. This guy's going to say it's open for mining. The next guy's going to come in and say it's not. And that's exactly what happened. The Biden administration comes in, they interpret the shrinking of the declaration as illegal. They do not see that the Antiquities Act gives the president that power. And so there we are. And those two will probably go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the reason why some of these monuments are so large is not just preserving areas where we find those resources, whether that's indigenous dwellings or if it's artifacts in the ground, if dinosaur remains, things like that. You usually want to have a buffer to those areas where you find those things for a variety of reasons. Could be for hydrology reasons. It's a whole myriad of reasons why they make those areas so big, but they tend to give them buffers. And I believe basically the Trump administration was arguing to rescind the buffer areas that were present there. So just kind of summing everything up, bring it all back full circle. Did Carter's use of the Antiquities Act in Alaska exceed constitutional powers of the executive branch, which is basically Article 2 of the Constitution? Supreme Court says he didn't, but that really goes back to the whole argument of, is the Antiquities Act valid to begin with? The Supreme Court has said it is, based on the fact that it was the powers derived from a law passed by Congress, signed by the president. But go ahead in the chat, let us know if you've got a different opinion. I'm not here to tell anyone what to think. There's no right or wrong answer. It's about us sharing our views. When we look where their checks or balances apply to the actions, I think we saw checks and balances there. Alaska took a note from Wyoming, had that state limitation. It has to be 5,000 acres, or 5,000 acres or more has to be cleared by Congress and signed by the president, not just declared by the president. So I do think we saw a check and balance there. Has it strengthened or weakened democracy? Has it stimulated civic engagement? I think it has on both sides. It's still a very divisive issue in the conservation and commercial community. And for better or for worse, depending on your view, it's inspired people to advocate for conservation or preservation of natural and cultural areas. It's inspired folks to engage their government for the opposite reason, to develop things for industry, commercial reasons. Again, I think it's stimulated activity on both sides, depending on your view. But this is still impacting our lives today. Definitely, if you're up in Alaska, this is definitely still a debate in that state today. It has not gone away. I don't think it ever will go away. And some other things in here. I'll leave you all with a quote from President Carter there, who we see fishing in Alaska. It is good to realize that if love and peace can prevail on earth, and if we can teach our children to honor nature's gifts, the joys and beauties of the outdoors will be here forever. I think that's a great note to end on. So thank you very much. That is the end of the presentation. I see we have some activity in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and address that now. I'm going to scan up a little bit. Okay, so I see, will you tour us around the library too? I don't think we have time today to do a library tour. I do basically have a slide presentation showing you our exhibits. You can go to our YouTube channel as well. I think we have videos of virtual tours where we actually, excuse me, have video cameras that go through our exhibits so you can see how it looks. So I would encourage you to visit the YouTube channel for that. Let's see. It's important to remember the government is made of people, and so by default, it's all our responsibility to protect the environment, etc. Governmental protection should be okay. So in response to my first question about what is the government's level of responsibility, is there any responsibility? Let's see. Patricia says, since we stole land from the native peoples, the very least we can do to beg forgiveness is to save these places. Only the federal government is large enough to make this happen. I've been fortunate to visit only a few sites and appreciate the Park Service employees. That's very nice of you to say, Patricia. I used to be a National Park Service ranger. In fact, one season in Salem, Massachusetts. So I know all about all the snow that you're going through right now. I know you see those snow mountains still when summer's rolling around in some places. Let's see. If they didn't for the common good, commercial interests would take over and probably destroy these areas. It's a good point too, RJ. That translates to other facets of land management, forestry, ranching. The U.S. Forest Service holds a lot of lands that they use for grazing leases. But yeah, that's a lot of folks aren't happy with the terms of a lot of those grazing leases. But chances are, if the government didn't own it, some cattle baron would, and you'd just be working for them probably. But yeah, that's a good reminder. Let's see. Let me keep. Okay, he responded. Is there a recording? Okay. If the federal government doesn't protect lands, culture, etc., then who will? I do think they should, with input from the locals. Very good. I know that's something National Park Service now takes a lot of pains to do, is to discuss things with local communities before they act. Okay. And I
And
think
Josh,
that's the end of the questions.
yeah, Josh, you also, and you may have addressed a couple, but there are also some questions in the Q&A box. Did you see
Okay.
those
Oh,
yet?
I see that now. Okay. How did Trump use the Antiquities Act? One I know off the top of my head, I believe it is a Civil War site in Kentucky. I can't think of the name of it right now, but I remember reading that he used it for that purpose. And I think there's at least one other that Trump used that for. Trump used it too. See, do I have any data on how much revenue the MPS has brought in since the inception of this act? That would be something you would have to do some research with the National Park Service. Um, and that's probably, might be a little hard to determine. A lot of the revenue is going to concessionaires. I know I worked in Alaska at Denali National Park and Sitka National Historical Park. Um, the park itself didn't have an entrance fee. Um, really, the only revenue Denali was taking in was from people reserving. Actually, they weren't even getting that from campsites because a concessionaire ran the campsites, concessionaire ran the bus tours there. They had the hotels in the area. The Park Service really, I mean, it's a service, kind of like the Postal Service. We're not there to turn profits. We're there to provide service. Um, so yeah, that might be kind of tough to find that, but I'd be interested to know if there was a revenue figure possible, but it's probably not that high again. Because again, this is Alaska really is a more so than I think the parks in the lower 48. They really are working with local communities, to provide jobs, financial benefits for them. Let's see. So thank you for that. Teresa says, ever thankful for environmentally forward-thinking individuals, especially U.S. presidents? Yeah, Jimmy Carter was definitely ahead of his time. Electric cars back then, mileage standards for cars, solar panels on the White House. It's a nice comment, Teresa. Thank you. Do the citizens of Alaska still get a yearly bonus from the oil pipeline? Yes, they do still get, I believe it's what's called a profit dividend check. And families get one for every member of their family. It's not just per household, it's per person. I don't think they're anywhere near where they used to be. I was in Alaska, oh gosh, over a decade ago. The checks were somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000. I've heard since then they've been below $1,000, but it fluctuates. But that also goes against your federal tax return. So it's not just all, you don't get your federal on top of that. They deduct that from your federal. So do you really get it? I'm not sure. But it is still in place there, yes.
And Kathleen says, I've really enjoyed this informative and well presented program. Great job. Thanks so much. So, folks, let's
Kathleen.
give, yeah, Joshua, as Kathleen said, really good job. Folks in the chat, let Joshua know how much you enjoyed today's program. Joshua, any last words before we start to wrap it up?
Stay safe out there. First off, most of you in Massachusetts, y'all got a lot of snow out there. Hope you've made your run to the store to get all the toilet paper, eggs, and milk you can. I guess for making a lot of French toast and going to the bathroom. I don't know, something like that. But hope everybody's warm where they are. They got what you need. Stay safe and keep on learning.
So thank you so much, Joshua. Folks, look for an email for me tomorrow with the recording, the feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. Next month, we're going to be learning about the Japanese internment camps with the FDR Presidential Library. So very important topic. So thank you all so much. Yes, as Joshua said, I hope everyone is recovering from the storm and staying safe. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. So thanks again, Joshua.
Very welcome. Anytime, Robert.
Have a good one. Bye.